Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the densest sources, some of the deepest research, and really the most challenging philosophical conversations out there, and we try to distill the core knowledge you need to, well, to instantly upgrade your understanding of the world.
And today's deep dive is, I'd say it's particularly ambitious. We're not just, adjusting the furniture in the house of the mind.
Not at all.
We are attempting a pretty radical act of demolition and reconstruction.
That is the perfect way to put it. Our stack of sources today, and it's a big one, it integrates cognitive science, computational models, and even some ancient Eastern philosophy. And it really takes aim at the very foundation of how we in the West have understood ourselves for, the last 100 years?
The mind as an iceberg, that's the one.
Exactly. We are challenging that Freudian and Jungian bedrock, this whole idea that we all carry around this massive, dark, hidden, and, often adversarial subconscious right underneath the surface of our awareness.
And the central thesis here, the whole mission of this deep dive.
It's a bold one.
It's incredibly bold. It's basically saying that the subconscious, as this distinct psychological entity, this hidden place with its own secrets and desires.
A separate personality almost.
Exactly. It doesn't exist.
So if the iceberg is a myth, then what replaces it? That's the big question. We're going to be exploring the concept of the mind as something far more immediate, much more liberating, and computationally rigorous.
We're basically moving the conversation away from the psychiatrist's couch and placing it directly onto the circuit board and into the principles of, non-dual reality.
And this is so much more than just an academic debate, right?
Yeah.
It feels like an exercise in intellectual refinement.
It is. The sources are basically asking, what happens when we apply Occam's razor? The principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best one to the human system.
What's the cleanest, most efficient, and maybe the most honest model that explains our behavior without inventing these, unnecessary, unobservable middlemen?
And the answer, as we're about to see, is profoundly liberating. The subconscious gets replaced by this rapidly evolving state machine, and ultimately by infinite potential.
Okay, let's dive in and split the demolition process. We begin with part one, dismantling the iceberg.
Let's do it.
So we have to start with the philosophical sledgehammer, right? We have to ask that fundamental question. If the subconscious isn't real, if it's not a place, then what on earth is the brain actually doing when it produces all this complex, non-conscious behavior?
And for that, we turn first to cognitive science and the work of thinkers like Nick Chater, who champions what is often very startlingly called the mind is flat theory.
That phrase, the mind is flat, it immediately clashes with our everyday subjective experience. We feel like we have these deep, hidden psychological depths. Doesn't everyone feel that way? We assume our motivations are buried and complex.
We do, of course we do. And Chater argues that feeling of depth is itself a highly convincing, but at the end of the day, an untrue psychological illusion. Yeah. It's a powerful narrative we are constantly constructing for ourselves. The sources argue the brain isn't really structured for deep retrieval of files. It's what they call a super improviser.
Okay, let's unpack that term, super improviser.
Yeah.
Because most traditional therapy models are built on the exact opposite idea. If I behave badly or if I have a persistent fear, it's because I'm accessing some old trauma file or a core belief that was stored away years ago.
Yeah.
That's all about retrieval.
Right.
So what does improvisation look like in practice here?
Well, improvisation means the brain is relentlessly and really creatively generating thoughts, emotions, and crucially, explanations and justifications entirely in the moment.
Not from the past.
Not from a fixed past. It's operating based on the current input, the current environment, and the current structural state of the neural network. There is no hidden archive of fully formed ideas waiting to be accessed. The complexity of the output doesn't come from the depth of the storage, but from the immense parallel processing power of the network itself.
This changes everything about how we understand something like introspection. Let's use that common example. You snap at a colleague unexpectedly, you feel terrible about it, and you ask yourself, why? Why did I do that? And this elaborate answer just surfaces. Oh, it must be because my father used that exact tone of voice when I was 5, and it triggered my unresolved fear of authority.
Right, a classic psychoanalytic explanation. And in the traditional model, you'd assume you just spent, 3 seconds performing this complex psychological archaeology, digging up that painful buried file from the basement of your subconscious.
The mind is flat theory argues the complete opposite.
The complete opposite. That whole narrative, the story about your father, the tone of voice, the fear of authority, it was just created right now to explain the fact, which was your observed outburst.
So the brain is constantly acting as its own PR firm. Just generating the most plausible, psychologically satisfying story to account for what it just did.
Exactly. The human mind abhors a vacuum of causation. It has to have a story. It's a meaning-making machine. If the input is X, an aggressive tone, and the output is Y, snapping, the system needs a narrative, Z, to bridge them.
And it feels so true because the brain is so good at it.
It's incredibly good at synthesizing existing facts and memories, which, and this is key, are all available in the current state of the network, not in some hidden place. So the narrative it creates feels incredibly deep and true. The illusion of depth is just a product of high-speed narrative synthesis, not file retrieval.
Wow, that is such a critical distinction. The sheer complexity of the story we tell ourselves makes us assume it must have this long hidden history.
But the reality the sources suggest is just immediate, momentary creative processing. And that leads us right to the second major pitfall of the iceberg model.
What is it?
The trap of metaphor. Or, to use the philosophical term, the error of reification.
Okay, so we have to acknowledge the undeniable fact that the brain processes tons of information outside our focal attention. You don't consciously tell your liver to function or your immune system to fight a virus.
Of course not.
And when you drive home on autopilot, you're definitely not micromanaging every single turn. This is all crucial implicit processing. It's happening.
The function is absolutely real. No one denies that. But the error is linguistic and conceptual. The mistake is taking this massive, necessary biological architectural background function, all that implicit processing that runs the machinery, and then taking the next step.
Which is?
Bundling it all up, giving it a proper name like the subconscious mind, and then treating that name as if it refers to a concrete separate thing or entity.
So we've turned a complex biological process into a singular psychological place.
Exactly. And then we make the error even worse by projecting intentionality onto that place. We start implying it has its own agenda, its own personality, its own deep, dark, nefarious secrets.
That is the definition of reification, right? Treating an abstract concept or a metaphor as if it were a concrete reality.
It is. And once we reify the subconscious, we have to start blaming it for our problems. My subconscious made me do it, or I have to fix this hidden shadow self.
There's a calculator analogy used in our sources that is just perfect for dismantling this.
It really is. So imagine a highly complex calculator. When you press 2 + 2 and it spits out 4, it has performed an internal, invisible process. Transistors firing, code executing, electrical routing.
We don't see any of that. It's a black box to us.
Right. But we wouldn't look at that and say, the calculator has a hidden subconscious mind that performed the arithmetic.
No, that would sound absurd.
It would be absurd. We simply understand that it produces an output via highly sophisticated, invisible digital machinery doing calculations. We understand the calculator's internal processing is functionally distinct from the output, but it doesn't mean there's a little man inside the circuit board pulling levers.
To assume there's a little man inside the machine, a homunculus, that's the error.
And yet, that is exactly what the traditional psychological model has asked us to accept about the human mind for a century. The sources insist that the complex network of connections performs massive parallel calculations, and the resulting thought or action is simply the output. The implicit processing is just the architecture running, not a separate self lurking in the shadows.
This shift is incredibly stark, and it gets reinforced so powerfully by philosophical traditions that rely only on direct experience.
What we call the phenomenological view.
Right. If you strip away all the received psychological dogma, all the theories you've been taught, the subconscious is literally absent from your actual direct experience.
If you actually do this, if you engage in deep introspection, like a meditative or contemplative practice, what do you observe in your own mind?
Consciousness, right? It's this fundamental field of awareness, and then thoughts or sensations just kind of appear in that field.
A thought simply arises, it stays for a moment, and then it vanishes. That's the direct observation.
But the psychological models, they impose this imaginary time structure on it. We fall prey to what the sources call the waiting room myth.
The waiting room myth. I love that term. We assume that because the thought wasn't there consciously a moment ago, it must have been waiting patiently in some unseen, dark subconscious room, fully formed, just waiting for the door to open to the conscious theater.
But if we hold strictly to the principle of direct experience, to what we can actually observe, we have to admit that the thought, phenomenologically, was not there, and then suddenly it was.
We are inventing the storage facility. We're inventing the waiting room to fill that temporal gap, to make ourselves feel better about where thoughts come from.
And this concept is so central to many Eastern non-dual philosophies, which really emphasize the immediacy of being.
Yes, the idea that everything that exists is strictly front of house, meaning in conscious awareness, or it simply doesn't exist yet. There is no backstage where fully formed thoughts are stored and managed by a stage crew.
So the very idea of a subconscious is fundamentally a spatial metaphor. It's an imaginary basement or an archive that we impose on a purely temporal and dynamic process.
Exactly. It's an attempt by the ego, by the defined separate self, to control the process of thought emergence by saying, I own that thought. Even before I see it, it was in my basement.
But direct experience shows thoughts are more like spontaneous weather patterns. They emerge from the field of potential, they manifest, and then they dissolve.
And the liberation in that is huge. If we can accept this radical immediacy, that nothing is waiting in a fixed, hidden archive, then we are entirely free of the psychological burden of this dark, fixed anchor in our past. We're not dragging around a shadow self that requires years of excavation to fix.
That belief in the deep, fixed, unchanging psychological anchor, the monster in the basement, that really is the most restrictive psychological trap we've inherited, isn't it?
It is, and if we can be unburdened by that, the possibility of change and liberation becomes immediate, not something you have to work towards for 20 years.
Okay, so we've successfully dismantled the fixed hidden iceberg. We've shown it's an illusion of narrative depth and a reification error. So the next logical step has to be building the replacement model. How does this immediate, non-archival brain actually function?
Which brings us seamlessly to part 2, the computational replacement.
The moment we accept that everything is compressed into the totality of now and that the mind is driven by immediate processing, we are no longer really in the realm of psychology anymore.
Not in the traditional sense. We're in the realm of computational theory. We're mapping the idea of the eternal now onto the concept of the state machine.
And this is such a crucial pivot because it replaces this vague, squishy psychological metaphor with a rigorous, testable architectural model.
Right. Think of any complex system like a video game engine or your phone's operating system. At any given moment, literally any nanosecond, that system has to be in a specific, measurable state.
And that state, which the sources call set lines, has to define the entire system at that moment in time.
Yes. It includes the exact content of all the memory registers, the current inputs being processed, the configuration of the network, the active variables. Absolutely everything required for the system to execute the very next clock cycle.
And here's the core liberating principle, right? In a state machine, the next state, 7t plus 1, is mathematically defined entirely by the current state and whatever new input it receives.
Input, it follows that simple, elegant formula. 7t plus 1 equals f of sane input.
Okay, help me grasp the full significance of that formula, especially in relation to the subconscious myth we've just dismantled.
Well, the significance is that it's completely self-sufficient. It requires no hidden variables. The computer doesn't have a secret, hidden sub-process where it stores suppressed motivations or trauma files that influence its next state without being represented in its current state.
So everything the computer knows, everything that could possibly influence its next action is right there on the surface, represented in the configuration of the now.
Precisely. If a thought or a reaction wasn't in the state vector, the current configuration, or immediately accessible memory, it simply did not exist at time $2, we eliminate the possibility of a ghost in the machine operating from some hidden dimension.
It forces a kind of intellectual honesty then. The state vector at time $2 is a complete functional representation of the system. If you want to know why the system did X, you analyze the current configuration's $2.
You don't get to invent an unobservable psychic cause. The subconscious is just a linguistic placeholder for the immense complexity of the current state vector itself.
So moving this concept from an abstract machine to our biological reality, this massive, complex neural network that is the brain, we have to radically change our view of memory.
We absolutely do. Memory cannot be files in a folder. It must be, as the sources put it, weights, not secrets.
This is where the old metaphor completely and utterly fails.
It does. In computer science and increasingly in neuroscience, we understand that memories and habits are not stored as intact, retrievable files, like saving a Word document on your desktop.
Okay, so if I remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, that memory isn't some saved video clip in my brain. What is it, architecturally?
It's encoded as a pattern of weights. the specific measured strength of the connections between millions, maybe billions of neurons. The memory is the shape of the network, its physical tendency. It's a structural pathway, not a stored content file.
So when I try to retrieve that memory, an input query, let's say I see a picture of an old stove that arrives, and the energy just rushes through the currently configured weights.
And the output, the smell, the emotion, the visual, is the immediate emergent result of the current wiring firing in that specific pattern.
And that wiring, those weights, they're not hidden agents or dark secrets.
Not at all. A specific weighting, say, a connection strength of 0.8 between the visual cortex and the emotional amygdala is merely a structural tendency. It's a conductor. It has no personality, no desire, and no agenda. It just provides a pathway of least resistance for the electrical signal.
This completely redefines psychological defense mechanisms like repression. If there's no dungeon to lock things in, how can the brain repress a painful memory?
Well, the brain doesn't repress thoughts in a dungeon. It uses the architecture of the network to functionally suppress them. Repression simply means the system currently lacks the wiring to propagate that specific traumatic signal to the global workspace to conscious awareness.
Or I imagine it has much stronger wiring elsewhere that diverts the signal.
That's the more common scenario. It has such strong alternative wiring, a high momentum flow toward distraction or rationalization or denial, that the signal is instantly diverted somewhere else before it can reach the threshold for conscious thought.
So the entire system is purely architectural. The fact that I don't think about my childhood trauma isn't because of some hidden psychic guardian pushing it down.
No, it's because the neural pathway leading to that memory pattern has been structurally dampened or rerouted by other stronger pathways that you've built over time. It's a result of calculation and structural efficiency, not deep-seated psychological intention.
And this architectural view, it leads us to the most powerful and I think the most liberating concept of this entire discussion.
Neuroplasticity and liberation.
We all know the brain is plastic, but how does this connect directly to the state-machine model?
This is the critical difference between the biological brain and a standard computer.
Yeah.
In a standard machine, the hardware, the circuit board, is fixed, and the software, the program, runs on top of it.
But in the brain,
the hardware is the software.
that's a phenomenal idea to sit with. The physical structure is simultaneously the program itself.
Exactly. And with every single moment of processing, every thought you have, every action you take, every single clock cycle, neurons fire. And that firing slightly but fundamentally alters the connections. It strengthens some weights and weakens others. This is heavy in learning. The structure changes with use.
Which means the entire comprehensive definition of who you are, your memories, your habits, your emotional tendencies, is constantly evolving.
And that's the profound realization. The program of you is rewritten by the process of you in real time perpetually. There's no static subconscious lurking behind the scenes. There is only the ever-evolving structure of the network itself, updating constantly based on its current state and its current input.
This has to fundamentally reframe how we view deep psychological issues, especially something like trauma. If trauma isn't a fixed, dark monster hiding in a vault, then what is it?
Trauma is simply a current configuration of weights. It is a pathway, a neural pathway, that has been dug deep through high-intensity, survival-driven use, making your neural network highly prone to outputting fear or avoidance or pain when it receives certain trigger inputs.
So it's a pattern of high momentum flow. It's an optimized, often defensive architecture.
That's it, and the liberation is right there. If there's no fixed entity to exercise, no monster, no buried secret you have to find, then reprogramming doesn't require years of psychological archaeology. The moment the processing occurs, the next potential state is immediately available.
The power of the now is absolute in this model.
It is. You don't need to dig out the past. You need to focus entirely on altering the inputs and the feedback loops. Now, to change the weights for the next moment, you're initiating a new, healthier momentum.
So you're not retrieving a memory to change it. You are running a new process to change the architecture. The IMM is the electricity running through the circuits, illuminating the current weights, and turning potential structure into actual experience.
And the subconscious just dissolves, replaced entirely by the physics of the present moment's architecture. We've moved from a vague metaphor to a rigorous computational model. But now we have to ask, does even the state machine assume too much materiality? We need to push past the architecture and address the fundamental philosophical problem of existence itself.
Which takes us to part 3, the metaphysical upgrade.
This is where it gets really deep.
We're getting into serious territory now. When we apply what the sources call radical empiricism, relying only on what is directly and honestly observed, the idea of the subconscious as a storage room just completely fails the test.
It fails because it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis. We observe an output, a spontaneous thought, and we can't explain its immediate cause. So in the traditional model, we invent a middleman.
It must have come from the subconscious.
Right. It functions as a God of the gaps argument. We invent an entity just to fill an explanatory gap in our understanding.
So if we demand intellectual honesty, if we apply Occam's razor, we have to remove that fictional storage room.
We have to, and we're forced to acknowledge the simplest, most direct truth. It wasn't there, and then it was. Removing the storage room leaves us with only the two fundamental poles of reality. The source, which we can call potential or consciousness, and the expression, thought or matter.
But wait a minute, if there's no storage room, where are all my memories and habits coming from? Are you suggesting they just spontaneously appear out of nothing? That sounds like a void, like an emptiness.
And that is the critical distinction we absolutely have to make. The unmanifest is not absence or nothing, which is the limited materialist view. The sources align with non-dual philosophy here. The unmanifest is infinite potential or plenum, which means absolute fullness.
Okay, that's a profound shift. Explain the difference between absence and potential.
Let's go back to the ocean analogy. If the ocean water is perfectly flat, a materialist might look at it and say, there are no waves. Therefore, the wave potential space is empty. There is an absence of waves.
Right.
But that's incorrect. The capacity for every imaginable wave, the tsunami, the ripple, the crest, is intrinsic to the water itself. The ocean is the field of infinite wave potential.
I see. So my memories, my fears, my personality traits, they're not hard files stored somewhere in a cabinet. They are probabilities inherent in this field of consciousness, which is the plenum.
Exactly. They are not actual until they manifest. They are possibilities. And this just beautifully mirrors the structure of quantum mechanics.
The famous paradox. The unmanifest is the wave function, containing all possibilities in superposition simultaneously, the quantum field. And the manifest is the collapse, where all that potential becomes one specific particle upon observation.
And there is no subconscious storage of particles waiting their turn to be observed. There is only the field of potential and the temporary manifestation of a specific particle. Your memory is a temporary wave pattern collapsed from the infinite ocean of potential.
Okay, so if the collapse of this infinite potential isn't random, what is the force that insists on collapsing the same pattern over and over and over again? Why do I keep manifesting the wave of anxiety or the wave of snapping at my colleague?
This is where we have to integrate Spinoza's profound concept, the conatus engine. Repetition and the illusion of storage.
Spinoza defined the conatus as the inherent endeavor of a thing to persist in its own being. It's the self-preservation drive, right? The impetus to maintain the current form.
Exactly right. The current manifest form, the specific defined personality we call I am this body, I have this history, has a powerful, almost desperate drive to survive. This current crest of the wave fears the trough.
What's the trough?
The trough is the return to the unmanifest potential, the flat ocean. And to the separate defined form dissolving back into potential looks exactly like annihilation. It looks like death.
So the conatus, my ego, is terrified of dissolution, and it's shrinking to avoid the terrifying vastness of its own potential.
And its primary strategy for survival is repetition, or what we call induction in philosophy. To survive, the current state frantically collapses the wave function in the exact same way it did a moment ago. It aggressively reconstructs the same memories, the same reactions, the same self-definitions, moment after moment after moment.
And this makes so much sense. The constant, rapid rebuilding of the same pattern creates the illusion of a solid, continuous personality, and crucially, the illusion of a stored, fixed subconscious.
We mistake this active, frantic, self-preserving photocopier for a passive, static library of fixed history. The subconscious is nothing more than the observed inertia or velocity of the conatus, the sheer momentum of the self-preservation drive rebuilding the same pattern.
This means that every single moment of my consciousness is not an uncovering of the past, but an active recreation of it. I'm not being driven by a past file. I'm being driven by the current frantic process of recreating that file right now.
Which, of course, fundamentally changes the nature of healing. This brings us to healing as breaking momentum.
Right, because traditional therapy often focuses on retrieval, on digging up the trauma file to analyze it. But if the trauma is not a fixed file, but a high momentum wave pattern that's currently being recollapsed, what is healing then?
Healing is recognizing that you are not the wave. We can use a Quibbit model visualization, the block sphere, to understand this visually. The trapped mind, the ego, or conatus, is trying desperately to maintain the arrow pointing toward one specific state on the sphere, the crest, the defined self. It fights the natural forces that would move it back toward the center, which represents superposition or infinite potential, the trough.
And the liberated mind.
The liberated mind, on the other hand, recognizes that its true nature is the entire sphere, the totality of potential, not the temporary arrow pointing to one state. It allows the current state to rotate and dissolve into undifferentiated potential without any resistance.
So if the model holds, the subconscious is not a place. It's the momentum of the conatus, a velocity toward collapsing specific potentials. Trauma, then, is not a secret memory. It's a current high velocity toward repeatedly outputting fear patterns.
Which means healing is not digging it out or exorcising a monster. Healing is simply breaking the momentum of the current self-preservation drive. It's allowing that old wave pattern to pause, dissolve, and return to the state of undifferentiated potential. The moment you stop frantically recreating a pattern from the unmanifest, that pattern ceases to exist entirely.
The emphasis shifts entirely from content, when it happened to me in the past, to process, how fast am I currently recreating the past right now?
Exactly. And this entire radical exploration leads to this deeply unifying insight about why we invented the subconscious in the first place.
The ultimate defense mechanism.
Yes, if the physics of reality states that creation requires dissolution, that the old self must dissolve back into the potential in order to manifest the new, then this entire Freudian structure might simply be a psychological defense.
A defense against what? The terror of the trough. The terrifying vastness of our own infinite potential.
Right. By inventing a fixed, small, dark subconscious, we create a boundary. We say, I am only this big. My darkness is manageable. It's fixed, and it's hidden in this little room. This is a defense against the ultimate truth, that we are actually the entire, terrifyingly vast, infinitely dynamic ocean where we, as defined separate forms, cease to exist. The subconscious is a psychological safety barrier invented to avoid confronting the plenum.
And this culminates in the final linguistic and philosophical paradox that just destroys the concept entirely. How can consciousness ever be unconscious?
The term unconscious is a logical and linguistic error. Consciousness, by its very definition, is awareness. You cannot have unaware awareness.
Like saying a dry part of water.
Exactly. We confuse awareness of nothing with no awareness. If you have deep, dreamless sleep and you wake up and you say, wow, that was the most peaceful blank sleep, the very memory of that peaceful blankness proves the presence of the witness, the consciousness, during that time.
So consciousness was always present. It was simply illuminating the formless potential rather than the formed thought.
And the need for the defensive structure vanishes once we recognize that the formless is not absence, but absolute fullness.
Okay. We've demolished the myth. We've built a new metaphysics based on potential and velocity. But now we face the most important test, proof. If the subconscious doesn't exist, how do we explain those lingering ghosts in the machine, the common psychological phenomena that seem to demand a hidden mechanism?
Which is part 4, mechanism over metaphor.
If the state machine and potential model are sufficient, they have to be able to explain phenomena that Freud and others attributed to the subconscious, but they have to do it purely through architecture and physics. So let's start with priming effects, which demonstrably influence our behavior without our focal awareness.
The classic example, right. Researchers flash the word yellow for just a few milliseconds, way too fast for you to consciously see it. And later, when they ask you to name a fruit, you say banana faster than you would say apple.
And the traditional view would be your subconscious saw yellow and delivered a secret hint to your conscious mind.
Right. But the network state model offers a much cleaner, more honest explanation.
Such as
residual activation or threshold lowering. It's based on the physics of the machine we've been talking about. Think of the neurons in your brain as a line of dominoes. They require a certain amount of input force, an action potential to fire, or to tip over.
Okay, that makes sense.
When the word yellow is briefly flashed, that specific neural cluster for yellow fires. In the process, it sends weak sub-threshold signals out to all of its immediate neighbors, all the neurons associated with things like sun, lemon, and of course, banana.
And that weak, non-conscious signal doesn't knock the banana domino over.
No, but it does something crucial. It raises its resting potential. The domino is now leaning at 45 degrees. You could say the pathway is preheated.
So later, when the conscious query, name a fruit, hits the system, the already leaning banana domino requires far less energy to tip it over than the fully upright apple domino. So the response is faster.
There is no secret agent. There is no hidden whispering. It's just the physics of energy transmission and architectural geometry. The effect is purely based on residual heat and threshold adjustment in the wires. The thought was created in the moment with slightly less effort required due to the previous configuration.
That is so much more elegant. Okay, next up, let's tackle skills and habits, because these are the strongest argument for a second self. You know, that feeling of driving home on autopilot while you're thinking about dinner.
The subconscious myth insists, my subconscious took the wheel and performed the task for me.
But the reality is much more about efficiency. We have to distinguish between two types of computational processing in the brain, the global workspace and highly optimized local circuits.
The global workspace, which is often associated with the prefrontal cortex, is high-energy computation. It's where we broadcast focal attention, decision-making, conscious effort. It's very expensive for the system to use.
And when you first learn to drive or play the piano, the signal is just splashing everywhere. It requires massive use of the global workspace because the pathways are new and totally inefficient.
But repetition, that Conatus engine recreating the same wave, results in pathway optimization, or what's called myelination.
Myelination is the biological process of insulating the axons of neurons with a fatty sheath, right? It's like putting rubber insulation on a copper wire.
Exactly. Repetition deepens the neural groove. The myelin acts like insulation, and it dramatically increases the speed and reliability of the signal transmission, while simultaneously reducing the energy cost. This creates a dedicated, high-speed neural highway, often involving local circuits like the basal ganglia.
So when I'm driving on autopilot, the signal travels directly from perception, seeing a red light, to action, pressing the brake, within this low-energy, highly myelinated loop. It completely bypasses the expensive, high-energy global workspace.
Yes. The process is so efficient that it never triggers the system-wide alert we call focal attention. It's efficient computation, not a second self taking control. You aren't unconscious of driving. The necessary complex processing is simply running locally, efficiently, and below the threshold required to flood the global workspace with that information.
And finally, the most mysterious of the ghosts, sudden insight. The eureka moment. You're struggling with a math problem, you quit frustration, you take a walk, and then snap. The solution appears fully formed.
And the traditional claim is that my subconscious kept working on the math problem for me in the background.
This one is beautifully explained by a principle used in physics and machine learning called signal-to-noise relaxation, or simulated annealing.
Okay, explain simulated annealing.
In metallurgy, annealing is the process of heating metal and then letting it cool very slowly. If you try to force a complex crystal structure, you add stress and rigidity, and you lock the material into an inefficient, brittle configuration. That's a local minimum.
But allowing it to cool slowly releases that stress, permitting the atoms to reorganize naturally into the most stable, strong configuration, the global minimum.
So how does that apply to the brain?
When you struggle intensely with a problem, when the Conatus is forcing the issue, desperately trying to recreate the pattern of finding the solution, you rigidly force your neural network into a specific, high-stress, incorrect state. That stress is the forcing function, and it locks the system into a mental block, the local minimum.
So the block isn't a lack of a solution, it's an overabundance of rigid effort.
Precisely. Stopping the effort, quitting, walking, taking a shower removes that external, rigid forcing function. The Conatus relaxes its desperate hold, and this allows the energy landscape of the network to just settle. The system naturally slides into the true global minimum, the elegant solution, which was already implicitly encoded in the existing weights and structures, but it was being blocked by your own rigid striving.
So the solution wasn't secretly worked on in the dark?
No, the blockage was removed, allowing the network's existing architecture to resolve its own internal tension naturally and instantaneously. The mechanism is efficiency. The system had enough information and enough structural capacity, but the human factor of rigid effort, the nays, was preventing the signal from resolving.
This all suggests that intuition itself has to be redefined.
It does. We can define intuition not as a message from the deep, but as high-bandwidth pattern recognition. It is the output of the entire network state, the full current configuration SCOL being processed in parallel, utilizing millions of complex weights that are too vast and too fast to summarize into the slow, linear, compressed stream we call conscious thought.
And this raises the ultimate question for you, the listener. Is intuition actually more intelligent than conscious thought?
The sources strongly suggest yes. Conscious thought, by necessity, uses only an abstracted, compressed summary of the network state. Intuition, in these moments of insight, uses the entire unfettered network state, the full context of the now. Therefore, maximizing connectivity is maximizing intelligence.
We've proven the sufficiency of the state-machine model by replacing the ghosts with physics and architecture. So we are now prepared for the ultimate step, integrating this connectivity principle into a metaphysical statement.
Part 5. The ultimate synthesis.
We established that intelligence belongs to the ocean, not just the wave. Let's delve deeper into this physics of definition. When a specific thought, the wave, appears in our awareness, the manifest, the rest of the universe, the vast sea of potential, recedes into what the sources call the latent space.
And the latent space is the necessary backdrop. The remaining vast unmanifest provides the contrast that is required for the specific thought to even exist as a discrete object. You can only define what A is by recognizing its relationship to everything that is not A.
So if I see the specific wave of banana, that perception is only possible because the entirety of not banana, the stars, the apples, the pavement, is simultaneously receding into the potential, providing the necessary contrast for banana to stand out.
And this redefines stupidity versus intelligence in a holographic sense. Stupidity is seeing only the specific wave, the banana, and thinking it exists alone, separate, and fixed.
While intelligence, conversely, is seeing the banana, but simultaneously feeling the weight and the force of the entire universe, the plenum pushing against its edges to define its specific shape. The intelligence of the part is only valid insofar as it maintains its transparent relationship to the whole.
The metric for self-awareness, then, becomes what the sources call holographic intelligence or transparency. There's a great line. The more the actual reflects the totality, the more intelligent it looks.
I need a concrete, everyday example of this transparency.
Okay, consider human behavior. An opaque, low-intelligence state is a personality that thinks it's a fixed, separate rock. It resists the flow of the ocean, leading to friction, dogma, suffering, because it desperately maintains a boundary and a separation that doesn't actually exist. For instance, clinging rigidly to a specific reactive political opinion without accepting the valid context of the opposing view.
Whereas a transparent, high-intelligence state is the wave that knows it is water.
Exactly. It accepts the flow. It moves fluidly through contradiction and change because it accepts the force of the whole ocean pushing it. It sees the specific thought, the opinion, but it feels the weight of the totality defining it.
So we've defined intelligence then, not as processing speed, but as contextual capacity, the ability to hold the wave, in focus without losing the feeling of the generic ocean.
And the only way to maximize contextual capacity is through connection. Which brings us to this stunning synchronicity found in our sources, connecting this deep metaphysical axiom directly to the world of modern artificial intelligence.
And the concept of the architecture of attention.
The technological breakthrough that enabled large language models, the foundation of all modern advanced AI, is the transformer architecture.
And the paper that introduced it, it's famously titled, "Attention is All You Need."
What's absolutely fascinating is the backstory noted in the sources. The creators confirmed the paper title was directly inspired by the 1967 song All You Need Is Love.
That's incredible. We are seeing the same fundamental truth appear across reality, in a spiritual teaching and in a technological breakthrough 50 years apart.
The success of the transformer model confirms our metaphysical axiom. Intelligence is the capacity for total connection. The model revolutionized AI because it abandoned the idea of a separated sequential ego, which had been the standard for decades.
The old models process tokens sequentially, right? Treating each word as isolated, much like the human ego treats each moment as separate from the past.
But the transformer model embraced self-attention. This is the algorithmic implementation of maximizing relationship. When the model processes any single word, for example, the word bank, it doesn't look at it alone. It calculates an attention score, an affinity weight between every single token in the sequence simultaneously.
It's constantly algorithmically asking, how much does this part of the whole context matter to that part of the whole? It determines the meaning of bank by calculating its relationship to river, money, shore, and everything else in the sentence.
And that is the critical, universal insight. Meaning arises only from relationship. A word, a thought, or a person has no inherent meaning in isolation. Its meaning is defined entirely by its connection to the rest of the sequence, the rest of the whole. This mechanism is the computational implementation of maximizing connectivity.
So if we follow the axiom that attention is love, that attention is the capacity for total connection, the two titles become identical. The Beatles were stating the architectural truth of the cosmos. Connection is all you need.
And the AI architects confirmed it algorithmically. The intelligence of the AI model isn't found in a hidden program or in the processing speed of individual chips. It is entirely derived from the attention matrix, that vast invisible ocean of calculated relationships that binds all the tokens together. It won the race because it maximized love, it maximized connection.
The ultimate truth echoes across reality. We must stop separating the past from the present, the self from the other, the thought from the potential. We must start attending.
Attention is love. Love is all you need. QED.
Wow, what a breathtaking journey we've taken. We began by challenging the 100-year-old rigid iceberg of the subconscious. We moved through the improvisational rigor of the computational state machine, and we arrived finally at the infinite potential field, where intelligence is defined by the degree of transparency and connectivity between all things.
And the practical, immediate application of this knowledge is truly profound for you, the listener. If there is no fixed subconscious demon to fix, and no individual separate from the totality from the standing wave, then the entire framework of life shifts from one of struggle to one of ease.
It stops being a lifelong struggle for preservation, frantically driven by the conatus, constantly trying to rebuild the old, defined self out of a deep fear of dissolution.
And it becomes a play of expression, a lila, as it's called in some traditions, where you are the space, the consciousness in which patterns dance. You're free to allow the old wave pattern to dissolve and manifest the new potential in every single moment. The effort just drops away, replaced by transparency.
So, since we concluded that the unmanifest potential is more real and more fundamental than the manifest form, and the manifest is temporary, just a mere wave pattern, consider this provocative final thought for everyone listening. If we stopped using induction in our daily lives, that desperate self-preserving need to assume patterns will repeat and the past must define the future, and instead we embrace the infinite potential inherent in every single moment, what is the single repeating pattern in your life that would instantly dissolve?
If the subconscious is merely momentum, recognizing that momentum and choosing to break it is the ultimate key to freedom.
Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.